Thank you so much, Dr. Howes, and I want to thank everyone for being here today, and to Dr. Howes in particular for the invitation to speak. Sensory studies has been really fertile grounds for me since I was a graduate student, so it's a real honor to be here today to share my research with you. So my talk today is the seed of a new project I'm developing on the cultural prehistory of haptic perception, marked by new visual technologies like the camera and the microscope. The 19th century is typically characterized as an epoch in which the eye consolidated its stronghold as a powerful epistemological tool. I want to tell a different story. The 19th century witnessed a countervailing epistemology catalyzed by the new concept of the haptic, a term coined in this era to denote the tactile and kinesthetic feel of objects, a tactile perception that is not in opposition to, but rather opposable with visuality. Between around 1830, with early psychophysical research, and around the year 1900, which is when textile museum curator named Alois Riegel developed the concept of haptic vision to discuss the tactile grain of art. So between those years, another kind of knowing flourished, not abstract knowledge gleaned through distant observation, but rather practical know-how forged through embodied presence, through handling and holding the world of matter. In this haptic episteme, as I call it, haptic knowing restructured 19th century literary and literacy practices around an aesthetics of encounter, or what novelist Henry James, in a letter to educator Charles Eliot Norton, called a grasping imagination. Rooted in literary historical methods while drawing on the critical insights of the history of science, affect theory, and media studies, this new project explores the role of the haptic in revaluing experience in its everyday lived contexts. And it does so by recovering the material, tissue, or fabric at the etymological core of the word text, which means in Latin, that which is woven or weaved. While we know from the likes of Benedict Anderson and Jürgen Habermas that print publication dramatically shaped 18th and 19th century Western publics, this narrative conflates textuality and the public sphere as such with visual ink print. It overlooks the texts composed and circulated, as well as the literary imaginings and the literacies developed off the ink print page. Within the domain of literary studies, I argue that haptic literatures, from Emily Dickinson's hand-sewn fascicles to the invention of embossed print type for blind readers, which I'll get to today, instantiate not a cohesive imagined community, but instead a sensus communis or community of taste formed through the affective, performative, and quote unquote subliterary materials that ink has papered over, but that sketches out yet unrealized possibilities for what literature can do and mean in the world. In an era when handmade as a term became an aesthetic valuation, haptic perception radically reorganized distinctions between feeling and knowing, thinking and making, as well as art and labor. Giving the science, the art, and the craft of touch a central rather than contextual place in cultural studies illuminates the historically dynamic and ongoing interplay of the concrete and the abstract, the practical and the speculative, the real and the fabricated ingrained in everyday experience. Since its recovery by philosopher Gilles Deleuze, the haptic has been an important analytic for studying the politics and aesthetics of embodiment. It circulates in media studies as a proprioceptive technology of biopower, like Mark Patterson and David Parisi have shown. In cinema studies as a stylistic technique that merges image and viewer, that would be Laura Marx. In performance studies as the immanent materiality of space and time of chattel slavery, that's Tabia Nyong'o. And in queer theory as the visceral surplus of historiography, that's Elizabeth Friedman. I hope to thicken these accounts by unearthing the philosophies of experience, the biopolitical logics, and the aesthetic practices that has made the haptic a salient category of analysis in the first place. So that's kind of the broad scope of my project right now, but more particularly, this project expands upon a key concept that I discuss in my book, Sensory Experiments. And so I'm going to kind of switch over to the slide, the PowerPoint here. Pardon that awkwardness. Okay. So in my book, Sensory Experiments, I argued that psychophysics, which is the 19th century experimental science of sensation, remade the racialized matter of the five senses into genres of feeling. One of the most significant concepts that emerged from psychophysics is that of perceptual sensitivity. It first, and this is a concept that first took shape in the 1830s with E.H. Weber's research on the subjective experience of touch. In his experimental design, Weber blindfolded subjects and then applied two movable compass points to various points of their bodies, repeatedly asking them to report when they felt the 2 points, those 2 compass points, as one sensation. Based on his experiments, Weber determined a unit of measurement that he called the, quote, just noticeable difference between one stimulus and another. A couple decades later, his student Gustav Fechner adapted these experiments to determine the point at which subjects perceive a change in sensation, which he called the sensitive threshold. In his book, Elements of Psychophysics, Fechner stated, "The term sensitivity means no more than what is otherwise referred to by the terms irritability or excitability. These terms are generally used to refer to the evocation of sensations. However, insofar as all sensations depend on inner processes, one could well relate the term sensitivity to its underlying psychophysical process instead of to sensation." Here then, perceptual sensitivity names the point at which a change in sensation becomes just noticeable, right? Say the auditory sensitivity of discerning a whisper, or the olfactory sensitivity of discerning a faint whiff of perfume. Perceptual sensitivity is when a stimulus crosses the threshold of consciousness, allowing a subject to differentiate sensory intensities, like differentiate auditory intensities or tactile intensities, which then yields finely differentiated feelings. As psychophysics migrated to Great Britain and North America, it was taken up by evolutionary thinkers who saw perceptual sensitivity not simply as a switch point between mind and body, but more specifically as an affective capacity. In 1865, Scottish philosopher Alexander Bain wrote that, quote, "The feeling of difference between consecutive impressions is evidence that we are alive, awake, mentally alert under the discriminative exercise." Perceptual sensitivity then allows a person to act with rather than reflexively react to their world. The ability to discern fine gradations of color or texture became a valued characteristic of civilized cultivation. As inflected by social Darwinist thinking, perceptual sensitivity acquired a racializing function. It was thought to power human development based on the assumption that aesthetic microjudgments fine-tune an organism's relation to the world. For many late 19th century thinkers, perceptual sensitivity represented the psychophysical aspect of racial development, the idea that varieties of sensory experience stimulate biological development. Evolutionary racial science remade perceptual sensitivity into an affective capacity that channeled aesthetic judgments towards civilizational prerogatives. Psychophysical ideas thus sponsored the ordering of racial groups by their allegedly innate perceptual sensitivity. In the 1870s, Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, first proposed a sensitivity hierarchy of humankind. Galton adopted Fechner's experimental method to test the auditory sensitivity of the English population, and he presented his findings in his book, Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development, which is a book that's best known for launching eugenics, the program of biologically improving national populations by enhancing the reproductive success of those deemed fit for civilization. Perceptual sensitivity was germane, quote, to the cultivation of race, or as we might call it, the eugenics question, end quote, in Galton's words, because it was evidence of a fully developed mind. His psychophysical experiments revealed that, quote, two persons may be equally able just to hear the same faint sound, and they may equally begin to be pained by the same loud sound, and yet they may differ as to the number of intermediate gradations of sensations. The grades will be less numerous as the organization is of a lower order, and the keenest sensation possible to it will in consequence be less intense, end quote. Linked to biological organization, perceptual sensitivity became a metric of human difference. Galton concluded that perceptual sensitivity, quote, is highest among the intellectually ablest and lowest among, quote, the wild races, because, quote, a power of sense discrimination is an attribute of a high race. Perceptual sensitivity fueled the eugenic project of perfecting the body by allowing a person to cultivate consciousness itself. Thus began an aesthetic program of racial perfection that I call sensitivity training, which I'll speak about more today. In 1899, for instance, just to sort of lay the scene here, the novelist Theodore Dreiser reported on one such training regimen developed by a Philadelphia psychologist named Elmer Gates, who sought, and this is Dreiser's reporting, quote, sought to separately and rapidly train the senses to an acuteness and power of discrimination hitherto unknown, in the interest of guarding against, quote, false or weak registrations of sensation. Accordingly, for Gates, a person first establishes his threshold for each sense, and then, quote, when the least he can distinguish in these separate fields has been accurately measured, the real training begins. This training involves, quote, detecting, perceiving, and discriminating this least noticeable difference 40 or 50 times an hour for an hour daily during 2 or 3 days. So this is effectively a gym to like the equivalent of weight training, but for your perceptual sensitivity. Cultivating perceptual sensitivity became an apparatus of white supremacy, which I discuss in sensory experiments, insofar as, and here I again quote Dreiser, quote, the whole intellectual progress of the race depends primarily on this perfect sensory development. Sensitivity training drove racial progress while guarding against the supposed feeble-mindedness that threatened white racial futurity. Via sensitivity training, then, eugenics perfected the white race by honing its perceptual sensitivity. More to the point, sensitivity training reveals the extent to which aesthetics took shape as a racial science. So my book, Sensory Experiments, addresses the effect that perceptual sensitivity had on how social difference was imagined in the 19th century. But sensitivity training as a kind of eugenic regimen is really the cornerstone of my new project on the haptic imagination. Today, I'll discuss how sensitivity training extended to children as well, a class of human beings considered the most malleable because their minds were keenly absorptive and impressible. With the renewed epistemological currency of lived sense experience in the 19th century, teachers at this time and into the 20th century began incorporating insights from the new psychology into their new pedagogy. What I'm interested in then is how sensitivity training was institutionalized and made a key tool of individual cultivation and the perfection of racial civilization, not simply in the psychology laboratory or the ethnographic field, but in the European and North American classroom. More specifically, what I'll discuss today is how sensitivity training merged with, and in so doing remade, aesthetic education. And then for anyone who's interested, the rest of my talk will actually be printed in the Literary Studies journal, PMLA, this coming January. Aesthetic education, so I'm going to sort of discuss the relationship between hapticality and aesthetic education here. Aesthetic education is a labile term that variously denotes the cultivation of taste, arts appreciation, and fostering the imagination. But we tend to overlook an elemental definition, learning to perceive. This meaning indexes the aesthesis that underwrites European aesthetic philosophy, first defined by Alexander Baumgarten as, quote, the science of sensitive knowing, or the study of intuitive knowledge arrived at through the senses. This sensitive knowing, Schiller posited in his book on the aesthetic education of man, has a civilizing function. Hence, aesthetic education is a liberal project of spiritual cultivation that has the potential to engender the moral freedom necessary for a self-governing community of taste. In this Schillerian vein, early 20th century educator Maria Montessori wrote, quote, "The sensory education, which prepares for the accurate perception of all the differential details and the qualities of things, helps us to collect from the external world the material for the imagination and thereby renovate society." One way to understand aesthetic education then is as a sensitivity training, as learning to differentiate the details and the qualities of things through the micro operations of perception. At the impossibly granular and seemingly insular scale of sensory experience, distinguishing periwinkle from purple or velvet from satin, sensitivity training takes part in the broader imperative of aesthetic education to realize sensus communis by, and here I quote Jesse Raber, quote, "negotiating the tension between democratic autonomy and cultural authority." While Schiller's philosophy is a useful reminder of aesthetic education's basis in sensitivity training, it is 18th and 19th century literacy training that discloses what sensitivity training looks like in practice on the ground. Literacy is typically considered a technical skill, a springboard for reaching the symbolic heights and imaginative flights of the literary. One effect of literary criticism's subordination of literacy to literature is that the college classroom has become enshrined as the decisive site of aesthetic education, to the exclusion of the primary schoolhouse. As literary critic Patricia Crane has argued, quote, "the materials of literacy historically considered have a central and essential place in literary studies." 18th century print technologies facilitated what Crane calls alphabetization, or the process of internalizing the alphabet. She argues that alphabetization constituted a new kind of literacy that systematized the self and that underwrote the liberal subjectivity with which aesthetic education historically is aligned. In the case of sensitivity training, the self-possessive personhood that literacy buttressed entailed cultivating a literal and intuitive feel for alphabetic letters. This feel for language opened up new avenues of affective and intellectual absorption, yet, as we'll see, was at risk of being absorbed into the capitalist market. Practiced in institutions, sensitivity training instantiates aesthetic education as a humanist project whose liberatory potential cannot but generate new modes of governance. Situating literacy within the domain of aesthetic education requires tracking two crisscrossing genealogies of touch. A scientific one that moves from sensationalist epistemology to experimental psychology, and a philosophical/philanthropic one that moves from moral sensibility to progressive pedagogy. Crucially, both genealogies lead us through disability. For although the scenes of investigation may change, the laboratory, the asylum, the school, the one constant is blindness, both hypothetical and real. Following Mara Mills's insight that media theory emerged alongside and through the construction of disability, I argue that aesthetic education develops through lived and imagined blindness. Returning aesthetic education to its bodily orientations, to its sensational basis, entails addressing the physical constraint, specifically visual impairment, that makes judgment possible. Disability, which is an idiomatic blind spot in aesthetic philosophy, reframes literacy as a practice of knowledge arrived at through tactile, not visual conduits of feeling. Taste, in other words, begins with touch, a sense that transforms judgment from an act of disinterested reflection into one of intentional intimacy. At the nexus of philosophy, psychology, and philanthropy, sensitivity training demonstrates that the written alphabet is a concrete form to be engaged on its own sensuous terms, and that in turn, imaginative acts inhere in the, quote, merely mechanical. So sensitivity training was formalized by psychophysics, but it has its origins in John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, which laid out his sensationalist epistemology, which I'm sure many of us are acquainted with, the idea that ideas are not innate, but engendered by the senses. Locke used a thought experiment called Molyneux's problem to explain his theory. If a blind person has their vision restored, will they immediately be able to recognize objects visually? No, he argued, because knowledge is acquired through experience. 40 years later, Locke's speculation received empirical validation. Surgeon William Cheselden removed cataracts from a blind man who, although newly sighted, needed to learn how to perceive objects visually. It took him some time to visually recognize his own cat. The surgery not only proved Locke's theory, but also revealed the importance of blind people to studying how the mind, the supposed tabula rasa, acquires knowledge. As the science of mind increasingly favored empirical over speculative methods, blindness transformed from a thought experiment into an object of laboratory experimentation. As I've mentioned, in the 1830s, E.H. Weber recreated the conditions of blindness in order to investigate how tactile perception shapes cognition, right? So he blindfolded test subjects and then pricked them on the forearm with two calipers, moving them closer together until they felt the two sensations as one. By century's end, the calipers had been refined into an anesthesiometer for measuring tactile sensitivity. Touch duly acquired a central place in the new psychology, from Wilhelm Wundt's research on tactile sensitivity and so-called hysterics to William James's theory that touch manifests the surfacing of the hidden self. At the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, psychologist Joseph Jastrow used the anesthesiometer on a subject who needed no blindfold. And that was Helen Keller, whose tactile sensitivity allegedly proved the mind's ability to form ideas despite diminished sensory input. Keller embodied what Fechner, who himself had suffered temporary blindness, called aesthetics from below, which is this idea that the perceptual sensitivity, that perceptual sensitivity both precedes and makes possible aesthetic experience and mediation. Lockean epistemology generated a sensationalist science of mind and concurrently the moral philosophy of sensibility, which was predicated on what science historian Jessica Riskin calls the sentimental empiricist elevation of feeling as the ultimate arbiter of truth. Blindness again became an important test case, this time for determining how perception shapes our beliefs. Diderot, for instance, claims that because sight is the main conduit through which knowledge enters the soul, blind people must be solipsistic, incapable of sympathy, and insensible to moral, aesthetic, and religious ideas. Taking up Diderot's cause at the end of the 18th century, Parisian Valentin Rouy established a free public school for blind children with the aim of assimilating these socially isolated persons. If blind people could emerge, quote, as fully developed rational beings, Mark Patterson explains, quote, a more perfect emblem of Enlightenment education and the supposed abstract knowledge within darkness would be difficult to find. In 1800, physician Jean-Marc Gaspard Itaud famously socialized Victor, the languageless wild boy of Aveyron, at the Paris Institute for Deaf Mutes. Itaud's pedagogical experiment provided crucial clues into the development of language and judgment, and it demonstrated the potential for education to civilized, quote, pre-cultural beings. Not simply the poor, disabled people constituting Europe's, quote, dependent classes, but the African, Asian, and Aboriginal primitives, quote unquote, that European nations colonized as well. Midwife to the liberal state, sensibility philosophy found institutional expression in medical cum philanthropic efforts to inscribe the blank minds of the world with enabling knowledge. While literacy was a cornerstone of social membership broadly, these new institutions for blind and deaf children installed a notably non-normative, socially distinct relation to language. Here you can sort of see, make out the pinpricking there. So at Roux's school, students employed pinpricking to write and read by touch. So they would use a pencil-like object with a pin at the end to puncture alphabetic letters into paper, which is very time-consuming and laborious, but it was how they first developed their own kind of print literacy. We appropriated these and other inventions to develop a system of embossed print. So an embossed print is these enlarged alphabetic letters that you can see stand out in relief from the surface of the page. And so he developed his system of embossed print that remade literacy into an exclusively tactile practice. In the 1820s, Roux's student, Louis Braille, created the innovative Braille system, and a decade later, American reformer Samuel Gridley Howe invented his own print type, Boston line letter. So you can see on the right-hand side, it's actually a key to what the dot system that Bly invented, what that means. And I would direct people who are interested in this to David Weimer's scholarship on tactile maps in the early 19th century, which is really fascinating. And then also as well, my own earlier work on what was called in the 19th century, the War of the Dots, which is about these competing embossed print systems for tactile literacy for blind readers and writers. Samuel Gridley Howe established an embossed printing press at the newly founded New England Asylum for the Blind in the 1830s, which provided students with textbooks, primers, and New Testament passages that they could read. His celebrated deafblind student, Laura Bridgman, there's a picture of her reading by touch, embodied the promise of tactile literacy. In her biography of Bridgman, Elizabeth Gitter explains that the young woman's ability to use touch for the purposes of communication and ideation, quote, proved that modern education worked, that humans were perfectible, and that the optimism of the reformers was neither naive nor presumptuous. If Laura could be rescued, anyone could. Touch, the medium of literacy, yoked aesthetic education to the institutional treatment of disability. These adjacent genealogies of tactile sensitivity converged finally in the progressive era Montessori classroom. Like thinkers and reformers before her, Maria Montessori believed that ascertaining the sensory basis of ideas required blank minds to study, and that those blank minds, whether housed in juvenile, disabled, or racialized bodies, acquire ideas first through touch. An acolyte of Montessori's, the American author and activist Dorothy Canfield Fisher, reported in her 1912 domestic manual, A Montessori Mother, quote, "The natural way for little ones to learn about things is to touch them. Dr. Montessori found that the fingertips of little children are extremely sensitive, and she claims that there is no necessity why this valuable faculty, only retained by most adults in the event of blindness, should be lost so completely in later life." Overturning centuries, if not millennia, of Western thought that prioritized sight as the most important conduit of knowledge, Montessori made sensory educational foundational to children's education, and further enshrined the skin as a primary point of entry into literacy and learning, the world of ideas. In 1906, she opened the Casa dei Bambini, known in English as the Children's House, which was really not a house, but a room in a tenement building. She opened up her children's house to the children of Rome's working poor. And an interesting side note is that basically the president of a holding company for the Italian bank, the Banca d'Italia, had asked Montessori to keep the children in the tenement building busy while their parents worked, because with the parents gone, the children were basically defacing valuable investment property. So this was all in service of like reproducing and maintaining capital. So the success of Montessori's program, which is not simply urban renewal, which is what the Bank of Italy wanted. It wasn't simply urban renewal, but what emerged was 5-year-old children able to read and write with ease. And this brought her immediate international fame in the early 20th century. The novelty of the Montessori method was that it applied the pedagogical methods and materials for disabled children to non-disabled children. So in her first book, The Montessori Method, which came out in 1909 and then received its first English translation in 1912. So in the Montessori Method, Montessori explains that what she calls her touch-first pedagogy, when, quote, used with deficients, makes education possible, while with normal children, it provokes auto-education, end quote, or self-motivated learning. If sensitivity training increased the self-reliance of disabled children by this logic, then it could nurture self-cultivation in so-called normal children. Indeed, the principle of self-cultivation was a cornerstone of 19th century educational reform. At the time, compulsory education for the masses had produced schools that resembled factory floors and that implemented literacy training through rote learning, regimentation, and examination. In response, pedagogues drew on the Romantic educational philosophy of Rousseau to advocate for the child's autonomy and for the primacy of experience to learning. So notably, Swiss educator Johann Pestalozzi, for instance, created what we call object lessons, in which the examination, the process of learning to perceive, matters more than the material itself. And Sarah Ann Carter has a great book on this called Object Lessons. Later, Pestalozzi's student Friedrich Fretwell invented the kindergarten as a space for children to learn through object-oriented play. So there's a turn to objects and materiality and the perception of those materials in the 19th century. And then we have, at the turn of the century, pragmatist John Dewey's laboratory school at the University of Chicago, which upheld a similar philosophy, though favored practical activities like sewing and basket weaving as a vehicle of learning and of ultimately transforming society. So in keeping with this Rousseauvian pedagogical tradition, Montessori devised her own plan for self-directed and experience-based learning. And in doing that, she drew on her own development in the field of medicine and science as a physician and a psychologist herself. So this plan involved using the new psychology as developed in the 1870s and 80s by Wilhelm Wundt to update this reformist pedagogy from Pestalozzi to Froebel and Dewey. So her book, The Montessori Method, and you can see it doesn't take much knowledge of Italian to understand that the Italian title, Il metodo della pedagogia scientifica, which is horrible Italian, I apologize, right? Loosely or more exactly translate not to the Montessori method, but to the method of scientific pedagogy, right? So she's remaking educational reform into a science and using psychology to do that. So she begins her book on the first page, she says, quote, experimental psychology, which from Weber and Fechner to Wundt has become organized into a new science, seems destined to furnish the new pedagogy. Sensitivity training was the means to rebuild what she called, quote, the old and crumbling walls of the school with, quote, the stones of the experimental laboratory, Montessori argued. One such stone was the aesthesiometer, which Montessori used not to measure tactile sensitivity, but to exercise the child's tactile sensitivity, much like Elmer Gates had done in Philadelphia in 1899. As with Weber's psychology experiments, Montessori's sensory exercises required blindness. The child either is blindfolded or holds, quote, holds his eyes closed while he touches different objects, Montessori explains, so that, quote, he will be able to feel the differences better. Scaffolding literacy, sensitivity training rendered the fingertip and the blindfold the child's first writing tools. And those are some images contained within the Montessori method, her first book. And you can see the blindfolded children learning to refine their tactile sensitivity. Montessori's method was notable not for its originality, but for its synthesis, a reformist pedagogy that implemented the Romantic principles of individual autonomy and lived experience by using not only the instruments of the new psychology, but also the didactic apparatuses developed for disabled children. To teach literacy as a tactile practice, Montessori combined the blindfold with specific materials like slips of sandpaper and cards and newspaper, and that she had borrowed from a French-American physician named Edouard Séguin, who is himself an acolyte of Itard, so the pedagogical genealogy is all there. And Séguin taught cognitively disabled children to read and write by first honing their sensoromotor skills. So she drew on Cézanne's work. And as Canfield Fisher explains in her manual, managing touch, quote, as a systematic examination of an object by the fingertips, such as a blind person might make, ensures that the child touches these varyingly textured surfaces, quote, always from left to right, so that the muscular habit will be established, which will aid them greatly later when they come to feel their letters. So already learning to touch, simulating left from right as one would write, at least in Western languages, right? Feeling becomes the basis of reading and writing here. The blindfolded child progresses from systematically differentiating surfaces and shapes to tracing in linear fashion from left to right the outline of alphabetic letters so that they come to know the form of the letters through specific textures and gestures. Laura Bridgman would have been familiar with many of the tools Montessori used, not only the aesthesiometer, but also pinpricking to build alphabetic muscle memory. These tactile motor activities proceed day after day, Fisher narrates, until one day, quote, they all invisibly converge towards the painless acquisition of the act of writing. Thus, although Montessori students do not use the same tactile alphabet as blind and deafblind children, right? They're not learning to read Braille or anything like that. Nonetheless, every activity prior to the moment where they lift the pencil or turn the page stems from these disability materials and methods that honed the sense of touch. In Montessori's classroom, literacy is not simply a skill, but a felt sensational sensitivity to form. The fingertips know each letter by the lines and curves they trace, while in turn, the sandpaper or variously textured ABCs coarsen and inscribe the skin. So here I'll just sort of conclude with some broader kind of thoughts and ideas. Caught in the contradictions of liberal modernity, sensitivity training displaces the ethics of disinterest aligned with vision, installing in its stead a mode of apprehension tethered to the erotics of texture, pressure, and weight. Sensitivity training thus has the potential to channel aesthetic education towards the illiberal humanism that American studies scholar Candace Chu argues can surface, quote, suppressed ways of knowing and being, while underscoring, quote, the conditions and processes of subordination. After all, tactile discrimination has literacy as its pragmatic end, but overall, during the course of this journey, the child learns the extralinguistic art of attentiveness. And what is attentiveness, if not an internalized blindfold, a means of deepening the experiential field by shielding the mind from distraction? Montessori designed the classroom to teach children to pursue their own passionate absorptions. So she designed the classroom as a decentralized space managed by a directress, not a teacher, but a directress, who she, and this is very steeped in her own like Italian Catholic early 20th century culture, but this directress is kind of a woman who acts as part psychologist, but also part Mother Mary. So this directress who worships the natural phenomenon that she deserves, that she's observing, and what she's observing is the child. So she's observing the child as a psychologist or a scientist would, but in a kind of loving Catholic Mother Mary sort of way. And her purpose is to, quote, awaken in the mind and heart of each child, and these are Montessori's words, quote, an attitude of one who has prepared an experiment and who awaits a revelation from it. Guided by the invisible hand of the directress and the classroom itself, the child is oriented towards literacy as a type of experience, a type of sensory experience. Neither empty vessels of signification nor mere conduits to ideation, alphabetic letters are aesthetic materials, dimensional forms that constitute their own body of knowledge. Aslant Western taxonomies of intellection, sensitivity training shears judgment away from vision. a disability history of aesthetic education, from the Molyneux problem to the Montessori aesthesiometer, recovers taste as a haptic practice, a proprioceptive mode of attention or observant care that holds close what it beholds. Yet the sensuous encounter with language that sensitivity training facilitates does not necessarily constitute a counterhistory of aesthetic education. To situate literacy along a trajectory of self-cultivation that begins in primary school is invariably to confront the aesthetic processes by which biopolitical subjects are made. For however liberatory the possibilities of aesthetic education, a sleight of hand is at play in sensitivity training. Borne out in the didactic materials, sensory exercises, and curated space that quietly directs behavior and attention, the Montessori classroom demonstrates that the romantic pedagogical principle of the absolute freedom of the child is discipline all the same. As the critic Ramsey McGlaser argues of progressive education, quote, the inescapable imposition of language masquerades as the child's spontaneous self-expression, such that the painless acquisition of literacy is but a more occluded form of constraint. From this Foucauldian perspective, absolute freedom swaps out an authoritarian model of instruction for a distributive, faceless imposition. No teacher, but a directress. No desks, but project stations. No rote memorization, but sensitivity training. The hapticality of Montessori's aesthetic education does not do away with discipline so much as it shifts the burden of regulation to the school child. The institutions that the Montessori classroom merged and from which it emerged, the laboratory, the clinic, the asylum, help account for the development of sensitivity training as both a vehicle of subordination and as itself a suppressed or submerged aesthetics. Speculative blindness and physiological blindness catalyzed new ways of being, thinking, and feeling, while science and the state used tactile sensibilities to further discipline blind and deafblind people. Indeed, the inner and outer knowledge that arrives from the tactile explosion into language and into humanity accompanied the injunction to become a self-sufficient subject. State asylums for disabled children taught needlework not simply to accelerate tactile sensibility or sensitivity, but to equip students with trade skills needed for economic independence. At times difficult to distinguish from manual labor, sensitivity training constituted a decidedly industrial branch of the science of sensitive knowing. So thinking about sensitivity training as rendering aesthetics a kind of industrial science. Aesthetics less an escape hatch from and more a hidden door into the market. A civilizing project that targeted disabled and poor children, aesthetic education situated moral freedom and free, quote unquote, labor as the obverse of one another rather than each other's opposite. Sensitivity training thus brings our attention to an originary fault line in aesthetic education. What is development, or Bildung in the German word, for some is training, or in German Heranbildung, for others. By incorporating psychophysical procedures into the primary classroom, Montessori developed a plan of tactile education that made use of touchable didactic material to hone the discriminatory capacities of school children in the hopes that students would come to understand their fingertips as vital instruments for knowing and encountering the world. As David Parisi writes, tactile sensitivity thus, quote, laid the groundwork for the subject's perceptual development throughout life, training that would prove essential for their insertion into the emerging industrial workplace. Nonetheless, the instrumentalization of the senses is also always an invitation to forge alternative sensibilities. Sensitivity training upends the transcendent trajectory of aesthetics while sketching out a haptic basis of reflection, in which judgment and other forms of sensitive knowing are imminent to sensuous embodiment, to intimate engagement with the world of things. When historically situated, then, the conceptual and material force of blindness in Western philosophy and pedagogy might be said to spin aesthetic education on its axis. The haptic practices, with their illiberal ethics and neurotics of handling and holding, that disabled people forged in, through, and beyond the scene of their institutionalization certainly teaches us that much. Thank you.
Erica, thank you ever so much for that tour de force. And let me just begin by stating the rules. You can either raise your hand or you can put a message in the chat. I will alternate between the two in terms of recognizing you. But if I can just begin by making a couple of points about this extraordinary talk. I'm conscious to begin with of the way Constance Claassen, in the deepest sense, a cultural history of touch, points out how the Middle Ages were known as the Dark Ages from the standpoint of the Enlightenment. But if you shift the register, all of a sudden, you discover that the Middle Ages were the world of touch. And touch was elaborated to an extraordinary degree. In a similar way, the Victorian period, we're all sort of conscious of the Victorians as being very hands-off, being very prim, being supposedly, very proper. And, there have been some exposés of how they were not. But the tactile, really hasn't emerged on the scene of understanding the 19th century. Maybe that's because, Foucault's influence, brilliant as he was, he sort of, distracted us with the panopticon, with the study of the gaze. And we've remained fixated on that. And so, this is where doing another history, a sensory history, a history that's not just of discourse, but rather of sensation, such as what you're doing, yields all these extraordinary insights. And unfortunately, we've only got a language like insight to talk about, what you've put on the table. And I was struck, by, it's not a counter history, and you emphasize that. And I want to come back to that. But I think it is a hidden history. And let me just bring out two more analogies, if I may. The science of sonar is based on the study of echolocation in bats and dolphins. In other words, humans take over and model that capacity of animals in order to actually map the ocean floor in a way that wasn't possible previously. What you have brought out is how mainstream education, especially Montessori, is actually modeled on and draws on principles of education for the blind. And as a result, this tactile propensity, this tactile skill that was otherwise invisible. And this is the basis, you argue further, not only, of aesthetic education. And you have this wonderful phrase, taste begins with touch. What you're referencing there is taste a la Kant, okay? Taste as disembodied aesthetic judgment. And what you're bringing out is another whole world of taste, another whole world of aesthetic appreciation that is grounded in touch and sensitivity training, as opposed to that sort of intuition or whatever that faculty was, which is totally disembodied in Kant. I mean, Kant denied smell or taste as having any aesthetic potential whatsoever. They were bodily and therefore not suitable. So it seems to me that we have to rewrite history in the wake of your explorations, okay, that we've been looking in all the wrong ways. And, especially this issue of how, techniques for the education of especially blind children, are actually informing, other educational projects, in a kind of appropriation. But, just as Mara Mills says, media studies begins with blind studies. You are bringing out how the tactile emerges in this kind of work as well. I have a very simple question, which this is how how grand I see your project as. I'm so delighted that you've embarked on this sequel to sensory experiments, which has so much scope. But Montessori schools are still special schools, right? They're not part of the mainstream. That mainstream education, if anything, art class is not treated very seriously. And in that regard, all that you say about the aesthetic and cultivating the aesthetic sense of children, what kind of impact has it had? Is it only a special area, special parents and special children that really see the importance of this, although the disciplinary power as well? This isn't a fair question, because you're not talking about mainstream education. But I was just wondering, Montessori, Steiner, the Rudolf Steiner schools, both fascinated by the senses. But it seems to me that the classroom is not a sensorially rich domain. It's not the kind of gymnasium that you're describing. There have been attempts, but they've been often quite feeble. I asked that question, and then I will open the floor to anybody who would like to raise their hand or put a message in the chat. Erica.
Thank you for your rich response, your generous and generative response. There's so many things to say. I guess most immediately in response to your question about Montessori, the interesting thing with that history of Montessori is that there was kind of a fad in North America between about 1912 to 1915. It was just a really short moment where Montessori was wildly popular. She went on a tour across at least the United States. I'm not sure if she went into Canada, but she had all these acolytes and all these women who were writing. There's just the amount of writing about her was really intense. But she was very dogmatic and had a sort of personal investment in her. I mean, I hate to use the neoliberal language of brand, but she kind of had that investment in this being there's no way to adapt. She didn't want you to adapt to anything outside of what she prescribed. And so as a result of those kind of restrictions, it was shuffled into private education. It might have been different if her method, she had been more open perhaps to different cultural adaptations of her method. But, I think that, thinking about the classroom as a site of aesthetic possibility, of a sensorially rich space, of course, now as a result, has gotten conflated with private education and therefore real class issues. Whereas before, quite frankly, her experimental subjects were impoverished children, which can't be overlooked. And kind of in that sense, in the Stuart Hall sense, racialized children, within Rome's slums. And it was only when it started to become exported to other countries that it was really only taken up among the privileged, the parents of the privileged. So there's a kind of interesting class history and dynamics and how the senses, and specifically tactile sensitivity, gets kind of allocated differentially to different populations via the Montessori method, which is why I think to the good point you made about a hidden versus counter history, which is that I think a hidden history is the more appropriate term, because I'm wary of locating in this story of touch some kind of utopian alternative to the Foucauldian narrative we have of the 19th century. I think that it's much more complex than that. And there are ways in which the turn to the haptic in the 19th century both sketches out kind of alternate sensibilities that pressure the kind of dominant distribution of the sensible, as it were, but that also still kind of invariably get wrapped up with that distribution and channeled in particular ways towards reasserting various taxonomies. But thank you, there's a lot to think about.
And just to say, the 19th century, another term for it is, well, for the mid-19th century, the color turn. you have the invention of these dyes, and everything becomes incredibly colorful. But again, it overshadows, it occludes these other terms that are going on that we need to explore. Bill Buxton, you had a point, if you'd like. You're still silent, I'm afraid.
Is that better?
Better, please, go ahead.
Yes, very enjoyable. I now better understand why my son didn't make the cut at the Montessori school. I think because he was lacking in the necessary discipline. He'd rather want to just play with all the objects and not in any kind of systematic way. So anyway, that was helpful. I guess my point is that in the late 1960s, Marshall McLuhan and Harley Parker were challenging museum professionals in New York by saying that their museological practice was overly visual, overly linear, overly Euclidean, space-oriented, and were advocating more of a tactile approach to be taken by museums, in which objects would be touched. Touching was not to be forbidden in museums, but rather it should be encouraged. It was an essential part of experiencing museums. And they're drawing on some of the ideas of a art theorist named John McHale, who said you could have a plastic Parthenon or a plaster Parthenon in place there that you could simulate then the real world by having objects that were available to be touched and felt. Were there precursors to this kind of thinking in the 19th century in terms of museology? I don't think Tony Bennett talks about this aspect, but there was a whole visual linear bias in museology up until this point. In fact, most of the professionals that encountered this were very taken aback and said, what do you mean? We don't have this kind of bias. This is just natural. This is the way it should be. But I'm curious as to whether, in fact, there were precursors to this. In fact, that people were thinking about refashioning museums along these lines. Interestingly enough, McLuhan then moved on to the school as an institution and tried to get away from institutionalized schooling and talked about the city as classroom, in which students could be exposed to the full sensorium that was lacking in the school system.
Thank you very much. I'm not entirely sure yet, though perhaps my research will disclose if there were movements in the 19th century within museum spaces to have a more tactile and immediate relationship with objects. But what I'm fascinated by, and this sort of is a adjacent response to your question, or coming from an oblique angle, is the effect that psychophysics and psychology had on the discipline of art history at the turn of the century. So analyzing art for this kind of formative field at the end of the century migrated from focusing on the artist's techniques or materials in favor of perception, right? The perception of line, of form, of color. And that in many ways came directly out of Gustav Fechner's work, where he himself migrated into aesthetics from psychophysics, writing a book called Introduction to Aesthetics in the 1870s, where he did kind of his first foray into what we would now call like empirical aesthetics, where he surveyed museum goers and said, well, how does this painting make you feel? Or what about the painting makes you feel this way? And based on that, tried to effectively devise a kind of empirical formula for aesthetic feeling and response based in sensory responses, right? Primarily visual. And so he just swapped out what he'd called the sensitive threshold. He then just renamed it the aesthetic threshold. So the threshold at which you begin to feel pleasure or displeasure of an object. So that kind of trickled in through William James, and then James's own colleague in art history, Bernard Berenson, who wrote a book in the 1890s on what he called the tactile imagination in classical art. So thinking about what were called touch images, right? These sensations or ideas that derive from the sense of touch. And then that ultimately gets us to Alois Riegel, who was an Austrian art historian and curator of the Textile Museum. And he is the person who first coined the term haptic vision to describe contra modern art, which he said was pure optic art in its play with perspective, classical art, early Roman art, which appealed, which sort of, he said, he described as deploying haptic visuality as this kind of the grain of the visual picture, the texture of the visual picture, inciting a kind of material sensory response in the viewer. So, you know, I think that even if, what I would say is that parallel to, or not irrespective of whether there was a movement in the 19th century to have, for visitors to have a more engaged kind of experiential encounter with objects. Although I can't speak to that, I can say that it was a museum curator himself who wanted us to think about art as visual art in these haptic, immediate, material, more embodied terms. And that kind of grows out of the psychophysical field and research. So yeah, that's not a direct answer to your question, but as I said, it's an oblique one.
These are very complex genealogies, and I think that this brings out, you know, very well how complex they are. And, you know, is McLuhan reinventing the wheel? And, you know, each generation seems to discover the senses anew, but there are different technologies, different social circumstances, and so forth. So it's not the same senses. And this is what makes this kind of, you know, investigation, you know, so very key. I'm hoping to hear from Catherine, who works, Catherine Young, who works very much on gesture and on touch. But maybe just before, you know, I give the floor over to somebody else. When I encountered psychophysics, okay, it was in the work of the Cambridge expedition to the Torres Strait, where they went and used all of these devices that had been developed in Germany to test the sensory acuity of the natives. And their working hypothesis was that, you know, quote, primitive peoples would be more sensitive than Europeans. And the reason for that was because they don't have as developed superstructures, that is minds. Okay, so the idea is that acuity of perception of sensation varies inversely with intellectual development. Okay, and indeed, French intellectuals at the time and scientists, many of whom, you know, were myopic and therefore had to wear glasses, saw their glasses as a badge of honor. Okay, they had poor sight, but that meant that they had great intellects. So, you know, these people in the Torres Strait, the islanders, you know, if they did well on these tests, testing their sensory acuity, it reflected ill on their intellect. Okay, and this was the Spencerian hypothesis, and you find it, you know, all throughout that time. So, you know, this was just, you know, the way in which psychophysics was inherited within anthropology, and you know, was quickly dismissed by people like Boas and so forth, who went over to a kind of extreme cultural relativism, and that whole sort of psychological testing fell out of fashion. But you've picked up another strand of the story, okay, which is actually the way in which psychophysics and sensitivity training gets taken up. You know, in your book, you talk about all these articles in the Atlantic Monthly and other very prominent American journals, and you're showing how it also figures in education. It's the opposite of the way in which, you know, anthropology framed this issue in, you know, the late 19th century. 1898 is when this happened. So I don't know the answer to this at all. But, you know, what explains the flip? Okay, because these are two very different understandings of sensory acuity. One, okay, you find it in savages because they don't have developed intellects. But the other, maybe it has to do with this idea of aesthetic as opposed to intellect. Right? And that's Baumgarten already is saying the aesthetic is a different capacity from reason. But this idea of the aesthetic, which goes in a different direction, embracing sensory discrimination. So again, you know, like Bill's question brought out, the complexity of the genealogies here. Do you have anything to say about that?
This is very, yeah, it's very complex. You know, my feeling, my intuition is that in anthropology, within the anthropological framework, growing out of, you know, comparative racial science in the 18th and 19th century, the thinking was that, yes, that these primitive, quote unquote, people had stronger sensory organs, right? They could smell more, or they had a stronger sense of smell, say, or a stronger sense of sight, right? But that is different than perceptual sensitivity, insofar as perceptual sensitivity is the ultimately kind of intellectual capacity to discern and discriminate these fine gradations of sensory intensity, right? So it's sort of, the framing was kind of that, you know, to go back to that Galton quote I had used, that of those of the lower order can maybe feel or sense more immediately, like that pure raw sensation, as you were talking about at the beginning of the talk, right? They have the capacity for more or raw or more sensation, but they can't actually like make these micro judgments. Whereas the quote civilized or white people may have a worse eyesight, they can see less, but what they can see, they can discriminate more finely, if that makes sense, right? Sort of that inverse, right? So they're getting less raw information, but what they are getting, they are able to, you know, discern and discriminate. And so that is kind of this aesthetic capacity ultimately that I'm tracking, right? How that gets taken up in cultural domains, where, you know, the thinking is that you can kind of perfect the population, perfect the race, right, by educating this sensitivity versus, say, like sensibility or sensuality.
Acuity. You know, yes, and I think that, you know, really what I so much appreciate about your work is that you put race on the table repeatedly, and you are illuminating how this is a racializing project, and either response to that question, you know, has a racial dimension to it, and you know, in that regard, psychophysics is not you know, a value-free kind of exercise. It seems that way because it's so, you know, it's just about measurement. But as I love it that Montessori used the esthesiometer not to measure the acuity, but as a thing to develop sort of sensitivity. So Jonathan has a question. Some of your talk reminded me of how Michel Serres describes reading the work of Merleau-Ponty and his coming to his senses and laughing about the distance Merleau-Ponty possesses in his phenomenology from actually experiencing the world. In the act of sitting and writing about sensation and having not much to do with worldly sensation as being outside experiencing anything. Where do you see the future of a sensory education training going after the archaeological work on touch? Or put differently, do you see haptic feedback breaching into the visual media you use for educating? So there's a little thing where Michel Serres laughs at Merleau-Ponty for only describing sensation and not actually engaging in it. But more than that, you know, there is this element of this idea of, you know, haptic feedback breaching into, you know, the visual media we use for education. Now, you know, right now there is no touch track on my screen. Okay, so Jonathan, I think you're dreaming. It's a long ways off. There's even a vibratory thing on my screen. But what about this idea of an invasion of visual media by tactile and haptic feedback?
That's a great question, and slightly beyond my own area of expertise, though. David Parisi is doing such fantastic work in that field. I think, you know, what I like to call the pre-cultural history of the haptic, because haptic as a term wasn't even coined until Riegel coined it in the early 20th century. So I'm interested in kind of what made the very idea of haptic perception possible. You know, disability is so central to that history. And I really take to heart Jonathan Stern's recent work on impairment phenomenology, right? Thinking about, phenomenology not in the kind of Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, ultimately transcendentalist tradition, but coming from a kind of a feminist, queer, Black studies, right, orientation that places, that always understands experience as necessarily politicized, right? And so, so I can't speak to actually what this might look like in terms of haptic feedback, preaching into visual media, but I can say that I think what this kind of history does get us is a richer sense of what this kind of impairment phenomenology, as he calls it, can look like, and how it has always been with us in a certain sense, right? Thinking about how we can think about subjectivity when subjects aren't necessarily in control of their own faculties or have, quote, diminished faculties, as Stern would say, right? And taking that as actually central to the experience of subjectivity rather than incidental or coincidental or supplementary.
Is it Diminished Faculties? That's the title of
that
Stern's
is
book?
That is the title of his book, yeah.
and I would agree with you. It's very important, for getting beyond the strong arm, able-bodied phenomenologist, who constitutes the world in a particular way. Stern really troubles all kinds of boundaries in that book, and it's a wonderful enrichment of phenomenology that results from that. So yes, I think that again, how much we owe to disability studies, but it was unrecognized. One of the leitmotifs of your work and Jonathan Stern's work as well. Could Montessori be described like what did Montessori? Was she a critical race theorist? Okay, was she? Did she? It seems extraordinary that she sides. This is Nestle's question with these disadvantaged children, and I'm just wondering, was she? Was there a politics to her education that had to do with actually raising these children who were disadvantaged from the slums and so forth?
No, she was a eugenicist, but so was everyone. With that caveat, I don't know if you're going to come across anyone from that period who didn't subscribe to eugenics. I mean, including Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois himself. I can't take credit for. I need to cite Suzanne Stewart Steinberg has a book called The Pinocchio Effect, and she has a brilliant chapter on Montessori, and she's a kind of Italian cultural historicist and does such a fantastic job of situating Montessori in her very specific historical and cultural moment. So the short answer is no, she was a eugenicist. But the interesting thing about Montessori too is that her politics were evasive. When Mussolini rose to power, she was, there was a picture of Mussolini in the Montessori classrooms. The assessment is that, she didn't fully subscribe to fascism, but she wasn't a revolutionary either. She did, I think, this just characterized mainly out of pride, really wasn't thrilled with Mussolini, and I'm not sure she's officially exiled or did kind of decide she was better off leaving Italy at that point, but it wasn't because she was incredibly anti-fascist. It had, I think, more just to do with like weird Roman Italian politicking. Just to give you a sense that, again, this is why I want to underscore that we don't want to see this specifically a Montessori genealogy of haptic education as a kind of liberatory project, because it historically is not. It can be used to different ends. So yeah, that's the short answer is the politics are labile, we'll say.
Thank you very much. But it's the politics of sensation that you're bringing out. And again, sensation for the longest while used to be below politics. and now you're putting it front and center. Catherine, please.
So my question is about the shape of tactile knowledge. And it seems like the early tactile education was still, the Montessorian style was still in thrall to the visual. So the channel of tactile learning was narrowed to how you could learn to read by tactile trainings of various sorts. But I wanted to suggest tactile knowledge is of a different character from visual knowledge or even from auditory knowledge. It's two-sided. Skin is two-sided. So it fuses the body with its object of knowledge. The object presses into the skin and changes the body shape, just as the body shapes itself around the object and changes the object's shape if the object is malleable. So with tactile knowledge, we're thinking about something like assemblages of the flesh of the world with the flesh of the body, to speak in Saving Your Presence's a Merleau-Pontian way. So tactile knowledge is the refusal to interiorize consciousness because it's not inside anymore. And it has to be distributed consciousness, distributed cognition, in which it's not privatized inside. And what you called, this was a wonderful line, the disinterestedness of visual knowledge as opposed to the erotics of tactile knowledge, the erotics, great way of thinking about it. And I just wanted to say one thing. I think there's an inherent rebellion in our cultures against the visuality of knowledge and the audibility of language in gesturality, which is the attempt to yet again grab hold with your hand of the objects that you are thinking, uttering, reading aloud in order to put them into the body, in order to get a hold of them again. It's Henry James's what you call the grasping imagination, and it's a wonderful idea. So I just wondered if you have any sense of how tactile knowledge could be interesting.
Thank you. That's a great question, how tactile knowledge could be interesting. I would say that I would want to sort of backtrack a little bit and frame these haptic practices as not antithetical to visual knowledge, but ultimately, as Montessori practices it as supplemental to, and you point that out. This, her theory, her pedagogical theory effectively reproduces the kind of psychological evolutionary logic, right? Which is that, along the hierarchy of sensation, right? Like the kind of Haeckel recapitulation theory, right? That one begins as a baby with tactile knowledge and doesn't have access to visual knowledge. And as one matures and grows, right, one achieves ultimately visual knowledge, right? So her kind of innovation, drawing on this disability history, is to say, well, tactile knowledge is something we can still retain, and we can still also reach towards visual knowledge as well, right? Because of course, the literacy that these children are learning is still fundamentally ink print, it's still visual reading, right? But she just begins with years of tactile practices and haptic practices in order to cultivate children up towards the discipline necessary for visual knowledge, right? So it's a way to build up to that interiorization, as you're putting it. I don't know, it's a great question, and I'm honestly going to have to still think about it, but I'm just kind of spitballing here to think with you.
Fascinating. I mean, to what extent does education do this? Put tactility in thrall to the visual. It's an ancient, culturally specific hierarchy of the senses. Whether it unfolds evolutionarily, I mean, if you start with Merleau-Ponty's tactile eye, instead of with the tactile leading to the visual, you always already get both. The eye touches things, which we never think of with eyes, as if they're remote from their objects of knowledge. But remember those old pictures of the eye reaching out to the object from early medieval inscriptions? I'm just fascinated by all this questions.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think that's precisely what we see, right? And this is what we see with Montessori, which is a mode of education in which, again, I want to emphasize the tactile and the visual are not competing against each other, but they're always kind of enfleshed and interdigitated, right? So that there is still like the grain of the object, even when the child is reading visually to a certain extent. So again, this is kind of counter, this kind of age-old juxtaposition of the tactile versus the visual, but we can see, basically I'm trying to argue in so many ways that we can see Montessori as a precursor to Merleau-Ponty. I did not say that outright in this paper, but that's kind of what I'm arguing.
Like it.
Thank you for helping me bring that out.
Okay. Thank you to all those who have asked questions, and thank you, Erica, for this extraordinary adventure in sensory history, that you've taken us on. So many genealogies, okay? So much work to do in the wake of this paper. So, thank you, but also, you've really thrown down the gauntlet, and we have to think about these questions about epistemology that Catherine was raising. We have to think about these questions of education and so forth. And just before we close, I'd like to note that this was the first, and what a wonderful beginning to the Sensation lecture series. The next speaker will be, I think it's on the 18th, so we're skipping a week, but it will be at the same time, and it will be Geneviève Théo from Agrotech in Paris, who will be taking us into the sensory evaluation research laboratory. Okay, so this is, really descended from Fechner. It is a direct descendant, although it doesn't, explicitly ground itself in psychophysics. But the sensory evaluation research laboratory is where all of the foods, artificial and otherwise, that surround us these days are perfected. Okay, so we're going to go inside these dark and secret realms, and it's going to be especially smell, and how smell is used in these contexts. Geneviève will be addressing. So thank you, Erica, for an extraordinary launch to this series. We look forward very much to following this new domain of research that you're opening up with sensitivity training. But already this was a formidable contribution. Okay, and again, the fact that I found I was underlining every second sentence sort of obviated the point of underlining after a while, but it bristles with so many insights. So thank you again. And we look forward to reading, further what you have to say on this subject.
Thank you so
Thanks
much,
everyone
Dr.
for being
Hess.
here.
Thank you.
À la prochaine.